and Indonesia transition from a dictatorship, the Suharto era, to democracy has been very, very successful. So I personally have an enormous admiration for Indonesia. When it comes to violence in Indonesia, there is no discrimination. To expect ASEAN to resolve the problem of Myanmar is also like expecting the UN Security Council to have resolved already the big catastrophe of Syria. We don't have.
Welcome to Tenggara Talk with Vermonte. I have a special guest, President of Timor Leste, Mr. Ramos-Horta. Very good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but it's more about Timor Leste and Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general. First, if I may ask, what is your perception on Indonesia given what happened in the past, Mr. President?
I familiar with Indonesia going back to the late 60s. Of course, I read about Sukarno, about Indonesia's struggle for independence. I saw movies, old movies of Sukarno as a speaker, mesmerizing speaker. And then during the Portuguese time, I befriended the then Indonesian consul in Dili, Elias Tomodok. And often in the evening I would go to his home in Farol. And he was very political. He didn't like at all Portuguese colonial rule. But in public events, I saw him always very friendly with the Portuguese governor. So I learned a bit of diplomacy of politics by watching him. And then I discussed with, at some point, with the new Portuguese governor, very good man, Fernando Alves Aldeia, because there was some tensions in the border, Portuguese Timor and the Waikusi and the NTT, because of land problems with border crossing. And I told the governor, why don't you invite the governor of NTT to visit Portuguese Timor? And he liked the idea. He consulted Lisbon, and the consul consulted Jakarta, and they all agreed. And the governor El Tari came to Dili. First time a top Indonesian official visit Timor-Leste. The first time a private jet landed in Dili. And the next day, everybody went to present compliments to the governor. I was the only one that when he saw me, he gave a big hug, Governor El Tari. Because I had been to NTT 2-3 times, bringing soccer teams, culture groups from Portuguese Timor, and with the NTT organized for soccer teams from NTT and singers from NTT. So my relationship goes back a long time. So I could see, then I came first to Jakarta, only 74. Well, from 74 to today, 50 years later, more or less, Indonesia changed dramatically, the world changed dramatically. Indonesia today, even you compare with the last year of Suharto rule, Indonesia is a major regional power, global influence in terms of diplomacy, because of its credibility, stability in Indonesia. One of the best performing economies in the world. I think it's number 4 performing economy in the world. And Indonesia transition from a dictatorship, the Suharto era, to democracy has been very, very successful. So I personally have an enormous admiration for Indonesia. So, and going back, so before, during Portuguese time, so and I could go on talk more about that, but for the questions of time.
Yeah. So you are awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think part of the reason is that because of the struggle. But then I think what's after, I think more interesting to me, that now, a few weeks ago, you invited me to the inauguration of the new Prime Minister, Sanana Gusmao. And then I felt and I saw no grudges against Indonesia or Indonesian people. So how you inspire the people of Timor-Leste not to hate Indonesia,
Yeah.
even to see Indonesia in a very favorable tones?
It goes back to the beginning of the struggle under a great leader called Nicolau Lobato, whom I knew well, literally grew up with him and his brothers because I spent 7 years in a Catholic mission school in Soibada, where Nicolau's father was, and his brothers and sisters. And he was always an extraordinarily intelligent and a very humane individual. From day one, he always said, we are not fighting the Portuguese people, we are not fighting Indonesian people. We are fighting for independence. So, and then many years later came Xanana Gusmão, pursued the same policies in the sense educating everyone that the struggle for independence in Timor-Leste was for independence of Timor-Leste and not against Indonesian people. So in speeches, in press writings, or any political writing, there was never any demonizing of Indonesia as a country, Indonesia as a people, or Islam as a religion. Never. We never use religion, ethnicity, or whatever to mobilize people and the hatred towards the other side. Because in some struggles, you have to demonize the enemy, the other side, to then make your side angry. When they're angry, they mobilize. I tell one story. Many years ago, in the beginning of our struggle, I did a lot of lobbying in Washington. I focused my work in New York at the UN, but by 76, I was already regularly, often going to Washington. I spent 1 year in Washington and got to know everybody. There was a congressman called Frank Wolf from Virginia, a Republican, very conservative. He initiated a law in the U.S. Congress, a bill in the Congress, that would automatically impose sanctions, mandatory sanctions, on any country that persecute Christians. So a friend of mine in Washington told me, Jose, you should talk to Frank Wolf and to action this bill to force the U.S. administration to impose sanctions based on the violence, killings against Christians. My answer was, no, that's not correct. The problem in Timor-Leste is not Muslim versus Christians. And many of the generals involved in the invasion were actually Catholics or Protestant, not even Muslims. And then I made a joke, which I said, when it comes to violence in Indonesia, there is no discrimination, whether you're Catholic, you're Muslim. So they said they're very non-discriminatory when it comes. So I will not encourage anyone to do that. So that's our policy from the very beginning. And then Xanana was arrested or captured, put in prison in Sipinang. And he himself, he said, it was in Sipinang. Sometimes he joked. He said his university was the University of Sipinang. He went to university in Sipinang. He said it was in Sipinang that he learned more about Indonesian people and he came to love Indonesian people. So
that was the seed.
And when leaders do not manipulate people's sentiments, emotions, there is no hatred.
So I could say that's the seed of principle of foreign policy that Timor-Leste is now pursuing. There's a big news today in the Jakarta Post about Prime Minister Sanana's statement about ASEAN and in relation to Myanmar. What's your view on that statement that Timor-Leste would not or would reconsider the plan to join ASEAN if ASEAN could not in any way solve the problem in Myanmar?
To expect ASEAN to resolve the problem of Myanmar is also like expecting the UN Security Council to have resolved already the big catastrophe of Syria that started more than 10 years ago. Security Council of the UN should have resolved already Yemen, Libya ongoing, eternal problem of Congo. When I was chairman of a panel of the UN called High Level Panel on Peace Operations, I was the chairman. And once Ban Ki-moon asked me about Congo, and because the Congo problem is going on for decades, it cost the UN, the international community, $1 billion a year. Already spent over $20 billion with no solution in sight. So you have much more powerful institutions in the world that have not resolved some of the oldest, biggest problems. So not fair to assign responsibilities to ASEAN for the last 2 years of difficulties dealing with a very complex problem. I know Myanmar inside out. The first ever international human rights course program conducted in Myanmar, I did it in July '94 in Manipur, in the Karen territory. And since then, even before, I was already familiar with Myanmar. I met Suu Kyi several times. I was the only Nobel Peace Laureate who went to Oxford to attend the funeral of Michael Aris, Suu Kyi's husband, when he died. And I was in touch with Suu Kyi when she was still under house arrest through her husband or through other people from Malaysia and elsewhere. So I'm very familiar with it. It's an extremely delicate situation in Myanmar because it has more than 100 ethnic groups, more than 18, 20 ethnic armies, some with a strong leadership, others more fluid, more complicated, like in the Hua army. Then you have a Kachin, Karen, and it is very difficult for the Burmese themselves to unify. They are doing it, and I think the Burmese, the Myanmar people are more unified now than ever in challenging the military. And having said that, I say, of course, we are the ones who applied to join ASEAN, and ASEAN did apply to join us. We applied to join ASEAN, and so I presume the statement by Ms. Shanana, either he was misquoted or he is expressing the anger, the frustration of the people of Myanmar towards the inability of the international community to resolve that tragic problem. Because our membership in ASEAN is a national consensus decision. It is in our interest. It is our geography. We are in Southeast Asia. Anyone looking at our data, statistics of trade, it is majority with Southeast Asian countries plus China. Day-to-day activities, cross-border, airline, passenger movement, student movement. It's with Indonesia, vast majority, and also with other Southeast Asian countries like Philippines, Thailand, etc. So we are destined to stay in this region, and being in this region, we are destined to be a member of ASEAN. And then within ASEAN, we will all try to help Myanmar. We are still in the UN, in spite of the utter failure of the UN to prevent the war in Ukraine. The war happened, still unable to resolve the problem. So are we going to quit the UN? No. I think I'm very familiar with the ASEAN leaders' effort in regard Myanmar. I have to say, I was very surprised when the coup took place with a strong stance taken initially by three countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, very strong. And that is unthinkable 10 years ago. And then since they have done, they are unthinkable in that one country that violates the charter and used force to change a domestic constitutional order is sanctioned. So Myanmar military leaders are not attending ASEAN summits, and so that I think should be commended, and I'm very, very impressed with that.
Speaking about ASEAN, ASEAN faces problem not only about Myanmar, but also ASEAN should walk a very thin line in the geopolitical tension between the US and China. How Timor-Leste views this geopolitical tension that has been going on for the last 2 or 3 decades?
Yeah. So far, all these years, we have developed great relationship with everyone. First, for both with our neighbors, the immediate neighbors. Indonesia is number one as immediate neighbor, Australia, and then others like Singapore, Malaysia that are nearer to us, and then beyond with Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, all of them, very good relationship. And beyond with Northeast Asia, with China, Japan, Korea, very good relationship. Even though there are tensions between Korea and China, between Korea and Japan, for different reasons that we know, historical reasons, going back to World War II. Very tense relationship between China and the United States, but we have a great relationship with the United States and with China. We have a common values with many countries, and we do also have a lot of commonality with China. And often China is misrepresented in the current tensions of today that has more to do with economics than with one country, the perception or genuine fear of one country wanted to dominate the world. For instance, in the 80s when I was living in New York, Japan was the bête noire. Japan was the bashing boy by the Americans because the Japanese economy was skyrocketing. The Japanese were buying everything in the United States, including they bought Rockefeller Center. So that was the ultimate insult. It's a bit like you go to France and someone buy Notre Dame, and the Japanese or Chinese buy Notre Dame in France. And that has to do with economics. Well, China is a global power, whether the Americans like it or not. It's a global power, benefited from American economy, benefited from peace in the region. Only through peace in Asia, in the world, that China prosper. So China is not interested in dominating anyone. It's interested in being respected. Because China is one country in the world that was abused, invaded, more often than any other country. Every little European country invaded China and abused, invaded. So they want respect. And they knew to gain respect, China has to develop an economy, educated people. So that's what they did. So we understand that, and we don't have to see China as a threat to anyone. But in international politics, when interests of countries come into play, there are always tensions, So diplomacy exists for that to smooth over, to negotiate, to find. And international diplomacy over the decades have found a huge compendium, volumes of experience of practices, how to resolve key to this is leadership. Leadership in Russia, leadership in China, leadership in the United States to resolve this problem.
If I may, one last question on the economy. Last time I was in Delhi, and, under your invitation, I brought home coffee beans from Letepoho district.
Yes.
Everybody pointed me to go there, and I could tell you it's the best coffee that I ever tested. So I brought home 2 kilograms of Letepoho coffee. And when I arrived back in Jakarta, I saw Letepoho coffee in Starbucks, already packaged nicely.
Yes, yeah.
So in a way, your economy starts to integrate with the global economy. So what would Timor-Leste do to integrate the economy more, at least with Southeast Asia region?
Yeah, Timor coffee now is even, you find in the United States, in many shops in the United States, you find it at the airport in Narita and Osaka, you find in South Korea. But more than that, we even already exporting fruit to Singapore. Is still small quantity. Some small Timorese coffee owners, they export directly coffee to Australia, bypassing brokers and so on. We have a great virgin oil, virgin coconut oil. We have vanilla, high quality. Cocoa was an experiment done by the European Union maybe 5-6 years ago. It was tested in Bali, the technology in Bali to test the quality of the cocoa, and they found it to be high quality. So, but besides that is oil and gas. And some people, when I tell them exactly what we do with our sovereign fund, they are surprised. I say, well, Timor-Leste is an international investor. We have almost $20 billion in our sovereign fund, of which 60% or so in U.S. Treasury bonds and 40% diversified. Diversify in two areas. One, we invest in other state bonds, government bonds, European bonds, and in equities, in more than 1,000 portfolios. Through smart investment, in the last 10 years, the return has been almost 9%, 8 point something, which is very, very high in the international equity market. And we use these funds and these money, sovereign fund, to invest in education, infrastructure, health, and diversify our economy away from the current dependency on oil and gas. But we discover already more gas onshore. Hopefully we'll reach an agreement with joint venture on Greater Sunrise, so that we reach an agreement, and then a pipeline will bring gas from Timor Sea to Timor-Leste onshore in the next few years.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you
for your generosity. I know you are busy, but it's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you again with the Tenggara Talk next time.